Hey there. Today I have a fun topic, or at least it's fun for me. And it's also kind of random, but I figured why not? Leah is currently visiting her family in Houston, so I'm all alone up here in Cleveland, living with my parents and my little brother and three cats, with not much to do except procrastinating studying for ordination exams. So why not do a video? And I figured that a fun topic and a really, in my opinion, important one for faith communities to consider is stimming. So stimming is stuff like this. Stimming is short for self-stimulatory behavior, and it's something that a lot of autistic people and people with sensory processing disorder, sometimes people with ADHD or anxiety, basically people who are not neurotypical do. But it's mainly a word used within autistic communities. So stimming is a way for us to have some control over our bodies in environments where we're feeling overwhelmed or underwhelmed by the sensory input. So say I'm in a really bright room. I'm very sensitive to brightness, and so when it's really bright outside, or I'm stuck in a classroom with fluorescent lights, my brain just sort of gets upset after a while because it's just so bright, and having to deal with that input that is painful for me. And that's the thing, a lot of sensory input is physically painful or uncomfortable for autistic people in a way it wouldn't be for most neurotypicals. I need some way to control what's happening to me. My brain has all this stress and pain building up inside it, and it needs some sort of release. And that's where stimming comes in. It's any kind of behavior, and it can be flapping your hands or stimming with an object, often called stim toys or stim tools. This is a rock. It's a piece of tiger's eye, polished tiger's eye, that I've really enjoyed because it's fun to look at. Visual stimming is a thing, as well as tactile stimming, touching it. There's auditory stimming, focusing on one noise, either that you produce yourself, such as like shouting or humming, or clicking, whatever, any kind of sound, or one that is produced like music or something. Focusing on that sound, focusing on a visual thing, a tactile feeling, flapping, some sort of movement, pressure stimming, all these many different ways of stimming as a way to regain agency over what's happening to our bodies and our brains, being able to have some control over sensory input by producing our own sensory output that sort of counterbalances it. And so stimming, if you can tell, is a really important thing for autistic people and some others who need it. Many of us need to stim in some way to function, or else the world is that much more painful and uncomfortable and just unfriendly for us, inaccessible even. For instance, I was just hanging out with my wife in a coffee shop the other day, and it was really fun. I like getting to sort of do, you know, the people watching thing where you see what people are ordering, just enjoying being with other people without actually having to like interact with them. Like we're all just chilling, having coffee or scones or whatever. I wouldn't be able to survive that kind of environment. I wouldn't be able to enjoy being in such a place and feel that connection to other human beings if I weren't able to stim during it. If I had to sit completely still in that coffee shop, the loud noises, the crowdedness, the lighting would be too much for me. I'd have to leave. I would not be having a good time. But because I'm able to like sort of flap my hands, biting my fingers is maybe one of my like more stigmatized stims. Is I bite my fingers in my hands a lot, especially if I'm really upset, really overwhelmed. Rocking a little in place. Being able to do things like that allowed me to stay and enjoy the little community that goes on in a coffee shop, or in a church, in places of worship when things get loud. Say they're playing an organ and that sound is just like filling my entire body and it's too much because organs are so dang loud. Being able to stim lets me stay in the church and not have to leave the building. So yeah, that's a little explanation of what stimming is. I want to divide this video into 3 sections. The first I just briefly touched on is that I think it's really important for churches and other places of worship or spiritual faith communities need to be aware that stimming is a thing in order to be fully inclusive and welcoming and celebratory of people who are autistic or otherwise not neurotypical. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that stimming is often stigmatized in our societies. Things like rocking or humming and talking to yourself, flapping, are looked down upon. People get insults and slurs leveled at them for doing such things, such as being called crazy. A lot of autistic people from a very young age are taught a slogan called quiet hands, where they're not allowed to flap and they're often physically restrained from flapping their hands or from rocking, and punished for stimming and rewarded for keeping still, because the people who teach those things don't care if on the inside the autistic person is struggling with being overwhelmed and suffering inside, suffering in ways that stimming could help ease. All they care is that they're putting on a neurotypical mask. If they look neurotypical, it doesn't matter if they're suffering inside from being overstimulated. Just act normal. That's the goal. And the fact that it's stigmatized in our society matters when we are trying to follow a God who centers the margins. Jesus, in his life, went to where the margins of his society were and made his center there. We see God doing that throughout Scripture and into our own day. God picked the people, a whole nation, and then individuals within it who were suffering the most, who were persecuted, who were abused, who were facing violence of poverty, violence of shame. And God picks those people to form her center around. And so to me, autistic people, when we are stigmatized for stimming, are one of those groups around whom God forms her center. So that's the second reason. And finally, third reason for having this video is I think that talking about stimming and seeing how autistic people move and interact with their bodies and the world can help tell us something about embodiment in general, and how all of us, all of humanity, all of creation, how we're all united in this physical world, what it means to be not just embodied spirits, but inspirited bodies. So yeah, let's start with that first point, the idea that churches and other faith spaces and communities could really benefit from understanding what stimming is, so that they can be fully inclusive and welcoming of autistic people and other people who move their bodies in ways that are considered strange or abnormal in our society. I'm going to be stimming in this video because it's about stimming, so I should be allowed to stim. So I want to bring some examples. I already have a little bit, like talking about how when I can't stim in a space that's loud and busy, I often have to leave the room. Churches, should ideally be doing their best to make everyone feel like they can stay in the room and really feel connected to everyone around them. When I'm not allowed to stim, I often, because I become so mentally distressed, I'm internally so distressed, that it does feel like a wall is being sort of thrown up between me and everyone else, where I can't feel like I'm part of this worship community, all joining to praise God in our own ways and in collective ways. So please let me stim, so that I can be a real part of your community. I promise autistic people won't just be included in your community. You won't just gain brownie points or diversity points. We will contribute. Just like anyone else, we have so many gifts to offer worship communities. The gifts of our voices, our presence, our insights. Because we are often marginalized, we often have special insights into what it means to follow a God who cares for the marginalized. And we often have very strong senses of justice. It's a common autistic trait to have these ideas of fairness and justice that are a little unique from others. So we're good people to have at the table when you're discussing things like justice. We tend to notice instances of injustice that no one else is noticing. We tend to notice little details in general that other people don't notice. So you want us in your communities, and you want us to feel welcome there, and even, dare I say, celebrated there. So I want to give some examples from churches where I have felt less than welcome and places where I have felt welcome. Often when I go to a new church, that's the time when I need to stim the most, because it's a new environment and I'm not, I don't know what sounds and sounds and sights and other sensory things are going to happen to me there. So I'm already going in anxious. There's also the added level of, as a trans person, as a queer person, I'm anxious. Like, what does this church really think about queer people? Or am I going to be misgendered the whole time? So lots of anxiety going on that stimming can really help me with if I'm allowed to stim. But it's a new environment. I don't know how people are going to react to the stranger who's rocking in the back corner. Is someone going to say something when they see me rocking? Are they going to stare? And I have been in churches where when I start flapping my hands or I bring something to stim with, I do feel gawked at. I feel stared at. And so I do my best to restrain the stimming. And that tends to be a pretty bad worship experience for me. I don't interact with other people because I'm too overstimulated. I start shutting down. I often go nonverbal, so I'm not going to interact with the people and get to know the community. And I might not come back. I don't feel welcome there. And then there are other instances of going to a church environment where I felt like no one was staring at me, for stimming. People seem to take my rocking and flapping in different ways. Sometimes people will ask me if I'm anxious, and that one, I'm sure other people have different views. For me, I don't really like being asked if I'm anxious or whatever. Sometimes I rock and flap. Often I rock and flap when I'm very excited. I have a lot of excited energy to let out. So that's something I forgot to add. Stimming isn't just for when you're feeling overwhelmed in a negative way. You can be overwhelmed with positive feelings and emotions. Stimming is a way to communicate all sorts of feelings, whether it's anger, upset, stress, or happiness, love, connection to others. There's so many ways we stim, so many reasons. So if I'm rocking because I'm really excited, I'm really feeling the music, and so I'm rocking and I'm flapping, and someone asks me if something's wrong, kind of, ruins the moment a little bit for me. But if someone asks me, I often, especially little kids, and I like this, a lot of autistic people would ask that if they have some sort of stim tool that they're using, which might often look like a toy to you, like if they have like a squishy ball or something, maybe a plushie. I love stimming with plushies. A lot of people might be like, oh, can I touch that? But if they need it, if they're actively stimming with it and seem like they need it, you probably shouldn't ask. Or if they say no, you can't see it, accept that. Don't be like, oh, don't be, you should share. But for me, I actually really enjoy when little kids in a church or older, anyone asks if they can see my, stim with me, basically. I usually personally bring a couple stim tools, so that I have one to share in case anyone wants it. I have a friend who I've been to church with before, or she sits in my seminary classes with me, and she'll sometimes ask me to borrow one of my especially my sort of my squish toy she enjoys. And at the chapel at my seminary, as well as at the church I attended, little kids were always asking if they could use, I have a fidget cube. They were always asking if they could play with that. And for me, when it's kind of hard to sort of get in and interact with people, it's kind of fun to be like, oh yeah, you can see this, and get to see them enjoy it too. It's kind of fun for me. It's a cool way to connect. And in those instances, I don't feel othered, because other people want to do what I'm doing. Even if they don't see it as stimming with me, they're fidgeting with me. They're using some sort of tool to enjoy themselves or help center themselves, ease anxiety, whatever they're doing it for, we're doing it together. So I really enjoy moments like that when people will join me, not in a mocking way. Thankfully, I've never had it in a mocking way. But really, like, they're into it with me, So yeah, the main thing for churches, when it comes to things like how to be welcoming is, ideally, I would love, and I'll probably make a video about being more sensory friendly, having options for people when it comes to things like the crowds and the loud noises and bright stuff, bright lights and all. But you're probably always going to have things in your space that cause different autistic people to become overwhelmed, because we are all overstimulated or understimulated by different things. So if you let us stim and you don't make it a weird thing, you have acceptance among your pews so people know not to stare or ask rude questions, that'd be pretty cool. So yeah, that's why I think churches should learn how to be more accepting. And ways to do that might be to have a little, mention it in a sermon, is one thing. I was going to say, have like a little class or something, or if your church has a Facebook or other social media, post some things about stimming so people know what it is. You could even have like stim toys available at your church. That'd be kind of cool. Have some stim tools, like some stress balls, fidget cubes, little plushies, whatever. Glitter jars are fun, like glittery stuff. Have some of that in a basket in the back of your church or something, with a sign explaining what it's for, explaining that anyone's welcome to take it, if they want something to fidget with during church. That'd be cool, like little things like that, to show that you're welcoming of this kind of behavior. You're not expecting everyone to sit perfectly still during church. That they can do with their bodies whatever they need to do with their bodies, even if that means standing up in the middle of the sermon and pacing around. It's not just children. That's one thing about being autistic. People infantilize us, because some churches are really cool with children getting up randomly or making noise during church. But if an adult does it, they're going to judge. Autistic people don't magically become neurotypical when we turn 18. I'm 25 and I still need to stim. So just making it clear through mentioning it in sermons, posting on social media, having a message, like a sign in your church somewhere showing that all bodies are allowed to do what they need to do in order to feel welcome and comfortable in your space. And then, the other thing I was going to say about preaching is that I have actually in sermons before, during my church placement, my field ed church placement in seminary, when I was an intern, I got to preach a lot, and I had a sermon that was it was a lot about stimming. The reading for that week was from John 20, when Jesus has just been resurrected from the dead, and he comes and visits his disciples as they sit in a room. He like phases through the wall, and it's really cool and stuff. But what he shows them is that he still has the wounds of the body that was crucified. He hasn't been magically healed, which to me is a way of showing that, again, here's some theological insight that you might not have without an autistic person who feels welcome to join your church. We offer cool insights sometimes, just like other unique groups. The one is that, to me, that story of Jesus with his wounds, and I got this idea originally from Nancy Iceland's book, The Disabled God, where she talks about the same thing, that Jesus rising with his wounds shows that disability isn't necessarily something that needs to be fixed, whether that's a physical disability like he would have had with these injuries on his hands his ability to write, if he knew how to write, to hold things, would be impaired. His fine motor skills would have been impaired with the holes in his feet. His mobility would have been impaired. With the hole in his side, he probably had some chronic pain. So just rising with those wounds shows that disability in itself isn't necessarily something that heaven's gonna fix for all of us. It's not necessarily something wrong with us. And so I preached about that, and during my sermon I invited people to stim with me, showed that I was gonna stim during the sermon. When you preach, you're supposed to kind of keep still so people don't get distracted by your body. And I usually am pretty good at doing that, like playing the neurotypical game and keeping my body still when I'm supposed to. But for that sermon, I stimmed freely. And at the start of the sermon, I even invited people to stim with me, if they wanted to, which was really fun to get the church to flap and hum and hop up and down or whatever they wanted to do, to just kind of feel their bodies, be in their bodies. And that brings me to that last point I wanted to get to, is that stimming tells us all something about being physical human beings, being inspirited bodies that we might not get otherwise. We have this unique insight into what it is to have a body, because we, more than most neurotypicals, feel our bodies in different ways. Things that to a neurotypical, such as the feeling of fabric, like when you're wearing a shirt, if you don't have some sort of sensory processing disorder, you probably kind of forget you're wearing the shirt. Whereas a lot of autistic people will feel that shirt all day, and the feeling of the fabric on the skin might feel nice, or it might be really bothering them. The sound, like the sort of humming that little electrical appliances make, that a lot of neurotypicals kind of tune out, we might hear constantly. So we have this unique way of interacting with the physical world that I think is cool for us to be able to talk about, and might help other people sort of think about what it is to have a body, with all the ups and downs of being a physical being. For instance, when I invited all those people to stim with me during the sermon, I was hoping that they would get to see what it's like to praise God with our bodies. It's a Presbyterian church. I come from the Presbyterian denomination, which some people call the frozen chosen. The chosen half of that little epithet is because of Calvinism and predestination stuff that I don't necessarily even believe in, but is associated with Presbyterians. The first half, the frozen part of the frozen chosen, is because of how still we sit in church, which is fairly common in a lot of the mainline churches, especially white-dominated churches. We don't move around a lot. And a big part of that actually has a really interesting history that I won't get into too much right now, but it has to do first with the Enlightenment way back when, a few centuries ago, when people like Descartes were talking about reason above all else. This rise in thinking scientifically and rationally, which is great and cool, except it was at the expense of thinking with your body, being physically involved with the world, these kinesthetic intelligences, as things like being rational and mathematical and scientific rose to prominence and gained validity. Knowing our bodies and being physically intelligent became downgraded and associated with negative things. And there's a whole history that involves racism and sexism there, because women were seen as inferior to men. They were seen as more physical, because black people and other people of color were also seen as inferior to white people. They were seen as more physical. So if you're going to be the epitome of humanity in these racist and sexist mindsets, you're going to be a white man who's able-bodied. In our day, we would say cishet, though they didn't really have that idea. You're going to be, and you're going to be still. You're going to sort of just see your body as a vehicle that carries your mind. Your body doesn't matter. It's all about your brain, which was also a Greco-Roman thought that influenced the biblical author and apostle Paul, who was raised in a Greco-Roman kind of culture. Despite also being Jewish, he had a lot of Greco-Roman ideas around the body being negative and bad, and separate from the spirit, which is positive and good and godly. And so we get these ideas from him that we should be separate from our bodies. We get these ideas later on from these rational, these Enlightenment thinkers, who really influenced the Protestants a little while later. People like Martin Luther and John Calvin took that Enlightenment ideal of being spiritual and intellectual, and they used it for their own theologies. And so it's really heavy in Protestantism, to keep still, don't move your body, just kind of ignore your body as best as you can, which doesn't work, because our bodies are what we are. We really are our bodies. There's a quote attributed to C.S. Lewis that goes, you don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body. And I was like, yeah, that's cool. And now I'm like, I agree, I am a soul, and my soul is both spiritual and physical. You can't divide the two. I am both. There's no dualism there. It's a false dualism to say they're separate. I can't separate my spirit from my body. My body is what lets me experience spiritual things. It's all I've got to do that with. And having autistic people in your pews who are stimming during church, who aren't keeping perfectly still but are moving, might help you think a little more about that, what it means to be a physical person who can bring your body into worship. You know, there are many churches who do. They just don't tend to be these white-dominated mainline churches. We can learn a lot, and sort of we can supplement our worship. We can add to our worship of God when we don't limit that worship only to our minds and our spirits, but also allow our holistic selves, including our bodies, to get in on it. So I wanted to close this video with a poem that I wrote for a class last year, a seminary class where I did an independent study on disability theology. And so I got to read a lot of different Bible passages through a disability lens. And one of those stories I kind of reread in that light was the story of David. In 2 Samuel 6, David dances before the Ark of God. So the Ark is finally coming back to Jerusalem, and David is so full of joy and excitement that he can't help himself. Even though he's the regal king, who should be, stately and well-behaved and regal, he dances. He strips down, is almost naked, and dances before the Ark. And one of his wives is really embarrassed about this. She hates that he does it, because what will people think? And even servants and slaves will talk and judge him, the king, for what he's doing with his body. And when I read that from an autistic lens, I really connected to it, because that's why a lot of therapists who work with autistic children insist on quiet hands, refusing to let them stim, teaching them to repress what comes naturally to their bodies. It's because the parents of these autistic people are worried about what people will think. How will my child get a job if they rock and flap? No one's going to take them seriously. And that's how David's wife was worried for him. And, she has a point. People do judge bodies. Like, I can see why she was worried for him. I guess I can see why parents of autistic children are often worried in the same way. But David dancing before God was a good thing. David letting his body be part of his worship was a beautiful thing. So is the stimming of autistic people and anyone else for whom stimming comes naturally. It's a beautiful thing for us to be able to use our bodies for our worship of God and for our ways of relating to the world that God made. It's not a negative thing. And I hope that people who know autistic people in their lives will encourage them to stim freely in ways that come naturally instead of mocking them or shaming them for it. And maybe those people will join in, even if you're neurotypical. Give it a try. It's really fun, and it can really help with stress. We all do it, right? You know, you're nervous, so you wring your hands, or you tap a pencil, or you wiggle your feet. You know, you tap your foot. Embrace that. Do it more. Our bodies are good. God calls our bodies good from the very start in Genesis 1. Our bodies are part of us. And so, yeah, without further ado, I'll read this poem, and then I will end this video. Stimming in Church. David did not let mockery or judgment shame him into holding his limbs still when his whole body was too overcome with awe and bursting at the seams with joy in God to keep still. So he danced before the ark, worship embodied. David, I too know what it is to have loved ones be embarrassed at the way your body moves and to do it anyway. So I will stim. As this body my God made for me desires, I will strum my hand in time to the guitar's praise song. I will flap my hands like the trees of the field when the preacher says something that ignites my heart. I will hum when things become too loud and bright for me, if humming is the life preserver that can carry me back into the open arms of God's peace. And if they treat me like a child, because of how I move or talk, or because of the stim toys I bring with me, well, God gave wisdom to the little ones to make the wise into fools. So go ahead and call me child. If I am a child, then God's wisdom will speak through me, and I will enact it with my body. I will flap and tap and rock God's wisdom into the pews where you stand so still and decorous. And David and Jesus will join me in laughing at the amazement on your faces as the Spirit spins with me, and in that spinning I find life. Thank you for watching, listening, reading, however you're consuming this video. Thank you. And please feel free to comment with your thoughts on stimming, whether you're autistic or neurotypical or what have you. What are your thoughts on stimming, and how we can make it more acceptable and welcomed and even celebrated in our worship spaces, how it helps you if you stim, or why you wish you could stim, what you think it might teach us about our bodies, if you think there are other Bible passages or the like that we could relate to stimming and being inspirited bodies. Please, let me know either here in the comments, or you can email me at queerlychristian36@gmail.com. It's always an option. Or visit me on Tumblr. There's a whole lot of places we can have this conversation if you want to have it. So yeah, go worship God and live your life and enjoy creation with your entire being, body included.